Hello again. Welcome to another episode of Leading from Alignment with our good friend, John Obolewski, and today a special guest. How are you today, John?
Jim, I'm doing good. I'm excited about our special guest today.
Yeah. Why don't you introduce him? I think he's going to be a familiar face to some and a new face to others.
Yeah, we have on the podcast today Shannon Shaffer. Shannon is the worship pastor at Auburn Hills Christian Center and in Michigan, and he is my worship pastor. I attend the church where he leads an amazing team. And Shannon has been there a long time. He'll tell us a little bit about that, I think. But he is just I think he's becoming a friend of mine. I hope I'm not overstating that, Shannon.
Oh,
But we're really delighted to have him on the podcast today.
Yeah. Welcome, Shannon.
it's good to be here. Thanks a lot for the invite, guys.
Right on. I think everybody, because you're going to be a new face, along with a new face comes a new story. So just in the beginning, Genesis 1:1 of your walk with Christ, like tell us about where did you first meet Jesus? Kind of give us your context.
Yeah, so my story is I was raised in a pastor's home, which means I heard about Jesus at a very young age. I did surrender my life at the age of 5. And during my teen years, the big overview is I kind of was lukewarm. I loved Jesus. I wanted to follow Jesus, but I kind of wandered in my teen years. It wasn't until we were in a revival service when I was 21, 22 years old. And I really made the decision at that time as an adult that this is not my parents' decision. This is my decision. I want to follow Christ. I mean, they had raised me well. It wasn't that at all. It was just that I hadn't really made that decision for myself. And so when I was 21, I rededicated my life to the Lord and haven't looked back since.
Love it.
That's so good. Your story is so, I hear it so often. Somebody who gives their life to Jesus at a very young age, and then they go through some sort of, I don't know what you would call it in their teenage years, just trying to figure out whether they really believe this stuff or not. Almost, and then they come to their own conclusion, and so often it's a good conclusion like yours. And it's just so cool to hear that. We have a special spot in our hearts for pastors' kids because both Jim and I'm not a pastor's kid. I don't believe Jim was a pastor's kid either.
I was an atheist kid, similar but different. Yeah. Very religious home, but
hopefully he was not a pastor.
No.
But we just love pastors' kids, and we're grateful for the good ending of that story. Shannon, somewhere along the way, you heard a call into ministry. Can you describe that for us a little bit? How did that unfold?
Yeah, so my story is a little unique in the sense that because my parents were pastors, they actually told me this as I was growing up, that they prayed over my mom's womb when I was in the womb, and they had felt God told them that I was to be raised as a worshiper. So my story is unique in the sense that I never had to really wonder what my call and purpose was because they actually intentionally raised me to be a worshiper. My mother was the worship pastor of the small church that my dad pastored. And so I was kind of raised to be a worship leader, worship pastor from a young age. And the blessing was I never had to go through this season of trying to figure out what God created me to do, because all of my training for 18 years was one thing, and that was to worship God on the piano, to learn how to lead people corporately in worship. And even though I was in that season of lukewarm, I mean, I was still in the church. I was still up on the platform, still doing worship. But it wasn't until, when I was 21 that I just really, really became on fire for Christ in a fresh way. But that was my story. That's how I came to do what I'm doing. I had this call from the time I was literally in the womb. They raised me, and I embraced it. And I said, I want to do this, serve the Lord this way.
Did you ever have that kind of Disney princess moment where you're like, I don't want to be what you want me to be. I want to be something else. I want my own life. Or were you always like in on that calling? Was that 100% from the beginning?
No, I mean, when you live with the person that's training you up, Obviously there's times where you kind of knock heads, if I'm playing the piano and she's in the bathroom getting ready and she's like, you missed a note, and it was just this constant training all through my life. There was a season in 13, 14, I was like, I don't even want to play the piano anymore, because it was just becoming like just too much for me. But I came out of that, and I'm grateful for all the training that I had. And I did, like I said, when I submitted my life to the Lord, that's really when I felt like this call reignite to just a different level. And it was during the years of the Brownsville revival in the mid 90s, where I saw this model. Lyndall Cooley was the worship pastor in that church. And for the first time, we saw someone playing the keys and leading vocally. And in most of the models up until that point, you had a song leader and you had an accompanist. And so for me, that all of a sudden it resonated, and I was like, I want to do that. Right. So that's kind of where it really took off.
Right on. I love that too, because from the piano, you can, the Holy Spirit can use you to actually create atmospheres, moods, 100%. Impressions. You're really moving to a different realm when you have full control, if you will, over that. You're not looking to a keyboardist hoping that she's psychic, and knows where you're going. You can lead people there. Right on. So tell us about where you are now. What are you doing now, and how is your story kind of building up to this now in its fulfillment, now in its full expression of what you're doing now?
Yeah. So for the past 23 years, I've been here in Michigan at a church called Auburn Hills Christian Center. Wow. We're an Assemblies of God church, and I've served as the worship pastor for those 23 years. 20 of them have been under my current pastor, Pastor Cal Garcia. Yeah. And we enjoy such a great relationship. My role has expanded over the 23 years to now helping him in some other administrative pastoral roles. But for the most part, that is still what I started doing is still my primary calling, my primary responsibility. And I can't tell you that there's been another time. This past year has been the greatest time of just refreshing. And I still am so in love with what I do. And I know that I read all the time that, about burnout, and, if you're in one place too long, you stagnate and all these things. I feel like I'm on fire, and that God is doing something so great in my heart. I couldn't be happier. And I'm so content and grateful that the Lord has just allowed me to stay, because we've seen so much fruit from being able to stay in a place for a long time. We've been able to see now parents, their kids are now coming up in the worship ministry. It's just pretty cool.
Right. Yeah. When you said 23 years, that strikes me as unusual. Yeah. For a worship pastor, or for any pastor for that matter, to have that kind of longevity. What can you tell me about that? Tell us about that. Like how, and this is off script a little bit, but I'm just curious, like how have you done that? How have you stayed and been fruitful for 23 years?
If I had to give one or two things, I would say that, first of all, I know what my calling is. And when you know what your calling is, it's easy to stay in that lane. Yeah. And the second thing is, I was just raised in a generation where loyalty was really, my father really, that was a big thing for him, being loyal. So unless I have some reason to leave, I just have a loyalty in me that says the right thing to do is to stay unless God says something other. And at this point, God hasn't. And so have I had to figure things out along the way and just kind of like rejuvenate? Absolutely. Has there been like different versions of Shannon through those 23 years? Absolutely. But God's helped me, and he's given me the staying power. But just knowing the calling, I've been called to these people. And unless God says something, basically audible to me, that's where I'm called.
Wow. How did you stay fresh? Because I think what I hear you saying is, like that there could be a tendency to get stale. Yeah. How did you do that? How did you stay fresh in the calling and not kind of get to a place where you feel like, man, I'm out of juice, I'm out of gas, or whatever? How did you accomplish that?
The truth of the matter is that there were seasons that I did stagnate. And if I didn't have those, then I wouldn't know what it is to stay fresh. So when you go through those seasons, like you have to find out, what is it? Do I need to break away? Do I need to have a mentor or somebody speak into my life? What is it that I need to refresh my soul so that I can continue to do what God's called me to do? And so, different people would come into my life at different times that would help me along the way. And maybe a conference or just a meeting with God in a revival service or something that would just reignite fire. But definitely there was seasons of you stagnate, and then you just reinvent yourself, and you're like, ooh, I'm coming back and I'm going to do this. But it's cyclical. And I don't think there's any way of getting around that.
Can I ask a question about that, John? The cycle part? Sure. So my question is, in the last 23 years, you mentioned Lyndell Cooley, and then keep going, right? Hillsong, very different sound than Lyndell Cooley. Bethel, very different sound than Hillsong. On and on it goes. I'm not saying there's a menu and you have to have every ingredient on your worship menu for every person, but how did you staying fresh, did it get stale because something got old and so you had to be refreshed by something new? Did you move from one genre to another during that time, or it had nothing 100%. To do with the lyrics? Okay, so it did have something.
100%. I mean, we loved for years. We were like, we had a choir, so Brooklyn Tabernacle was like something that we just loved. And then there was a change in choirs. They really weren't a thing. And when we had to put the choir to rest, man, that was a hard deal for me because I had started that, and we ran it 15 years strong. And that was a big deal. So there was seasons like that that had musical influences, but there was also seasons spiritually where I was not maintaining the fire. I wasn't doing the things that I needed to do, backstage.
Right. Yeah. So you went from the full orchestra choir robe, coming out of the 80s music, into a guitar and a candle and, overhead projectors through LED screens. Huge changes, right? And did you we call that the great hymnal wars of the 1990s. Did you kind of experience some of that? Every time there's change, people don't, they want to hear the song that they were singing when they got saved, when they got filled with the Spirit, when they got called to ministry, when they met with God at that tabernacle on the sawdust floor. They want to keep that going. And you're the one that says, no, actually, we're moving forward for the next generation. How have you handled that? The opinions of man.
I've struggled. I mean, I struggled through it because there was no manual on that. Like they didn't give me the manual when I started on how to navigate that. So I struggled through that. I looked to mentors, looked to people that were a little older than me. How are we going to work through this in a way that's healthy for the whole body? And then personally, I struggled because I'm the same way, Pastor Jim. I like a certain sound.
Yeah.
And so for me, I had to really be intentional to reach down to the next generation and say, hey, you're going to have to help me. Because as we're pivoting, I'm not liking what I'm hearing. In fact, I think there's a lot of garbage that's coming out right now because they're just overproducing things so fast.
Yeah.
And so this is my mindset, during these transitions, this is just no good. Yeah. And I had to wrestle through that. So, it wasn't just the people, it was me too.
Yeah.
But having different, we're multi-generational. So that definitely helps.
Right.
Shannon, we've noticed in the past couple of years, an increase, at least in our network of pastors that we help. And by the grace of God, we've been able to help quite a few. But we've noticed this uptick in turbulence with senior pastors and their worship pastors. And whether it's over, we're talking about worship styles, right? Whether it's over worship styles, which, I mean, kind of understanding, but the other thing that we're noticing is conflict over who's in charge.
Yeah.
And which I think is a more serious thing probably than the worship style piece. From your perspective, I wonder what might be some contributing factors to this, what we're seeing, this turbulence. What are your thoughts?
Well, give me a minute. I have a couple of thoughts.
Okay.
Let me just throw out a few ideas and then follow up with the one, that kind of strikes you. But I don't pretend to have a one size fits all answer on this one. Obviously, there's different situations, different levels of communication, different levels of expectations that people are coming into these relationships with. I personally have had an amazing relationship with my pastor. I've not had that. So I've heard, though, from a lot of my peers that are in other churches, several themes that seem to come up.
Yeah.
But I will say this, a couple of weeks ago, we had a young man from a ministry school come in, and here's what he said, and it really struck me, and I think this will help somebody. He said this: I went to ministry school to learn to be a pastor, and they taught me how to become more like Jesus first. And he said that my primary ministry that I'm being taught about is how to be more like Jesus before I operate in any calling. And I think therein lies the key between these relational struggles. We need to continually become more like Jesus.
There you go.
Right? So that's an overarching theme. But here are some specific things that I have seen and heard that could contribute to some of these turbulences. First of all, fear and insecurity on the part of lead pastors and on the part of worship pastors.
Oh, so you mean there are actually insecure lead pastors? I didn't know that.
He just told on us.
Woo! Yeah, and I'm not trying to call anybody out. I just know this is the reality. It's the reality. Behind closed doors, what I'm hearing, from people that are going through really tough situations is behind closed doors, sometimes lead pastors are not treating their staff the same way that they do publicly. Now, that can become a tipping point and all of a sudden create a rift. So that's one area that we need to really pay attention to. On the worship pastor side, I would say this, that some of them just don't understand their role in what their relationship is to the lead pastor. And they've built little kingdoms, and they don't want anybody to touch their kingdom, give them have any accountability. And what I mean by that is I was trained and raised to understand, and this is very important, that the lead pastor is placed there by God as the authority over a body. And as the lead pastor, he is also the worship pastor. He is the children's pastor. He is the youth pastor. I am simply an extension of his authority. And when I understand that I am an extension of his authority under God, then these rifts that we hear about, if you have that firmly seated in your mind, a lot of that stuff goes away, because these power wars we're hearing about is because somebody has the wrong idea that I'm in charge of the music, you're in charge of the preaching, you stay on your side and I'll stay on my side. That is not correct. That's not how God set things up.
Right. Man, that's good. That's good. I think that vision, right? That, I have a vision for a great worship team, and we're going to write music, and we're going to travel the world, and we're going to basically use your platform on Sunday to develop our abilities to do the greater things we want to do. And versus you have a vision, and my calling is to help accomplish that vision. I think that's very different. So talk to worship leaders, would you, for just a minute? People are in that position, but maybe they're 20 something, maybe as many years as you've been in your position, that's they haven't even been alive that many years. And they're the guy that shows up on time, and they're the gal that shows up on time, and they have a ministry. But I think you're certainly in the position now to speak as a father to sons and daughters, not just a son, so speak to the worship leaders. What sort of advice would you give them, especially as it pertains to this authority piece? So they have to report to somebody, a senior pastor, an admin, but what advice can you give them beyond what you just said, to help make them successful and that vision, the vision of the church, prosper?
Yeah, I wish we could say that every person is going to be in a healthy environment. Yeah. But Converge Coaching exists to help people that are not in healthy environments, right? So there are absolutely unhealthy environments out there. But I would say this: what I just said a moment ago is really key. Yeah, I need to become more like Jesus, personally. Every person needs to become more like Jesus before we look at other people, look at callings, look at offices and roles. That's the primary ministry, is to become more like Jesus. Unity is more important than anything else. I believe that the Holy Spirit can do more in a body that has unity than has great giftings, great talents, 100%. And all these things, but they have divisions, right? That's so unity 100%. Has to be protected. And I was reading this morning, actually, in my devotional time, Psalm 119 says this. It says, "Great peace have they who love thy law, and nothing shall offend them." And I feel like the more that we love the word of God, so if you're a young person, you're getting going to this thing, the word of God is like, you have to be consuming it, because it helps you to keep offense away. It helps you to keep some of these unhealthy things that maybe you didn't create. It helps you to deal with those so you don't pick that up and carry that into, and then just, carry that into a Sunday service. So those are some of the things I say: unity, becoming more like Jesus, and just guarding your heart. Like a proverb says, above all else, guard your heart, because it is the wellspring of life. We have to really do that, like, intentionally every day, because the enemy is out there trying to create wedges. And if we know that there's a plan, we got to be aware of what that plan is and sidestep that.
Right on. That's awesome. Thank you so much for that. John, do you want to wrap us up time-wise? You have another question?
Yeah, I do actually. A couple. Just a comment, and then another question for you, and then Jim, I'll have you bring us to the end here. It's interesting to me. You didn't say the word discipleship, Shannon, but you did. You said, I need to become more like Jesus. We need to become more like Jesus. It's funny how many of the problems the local church experiences come all the way back to discipleship.
Yeah.
In so many ways. And I don't want to oversimplify things, but in many ways, most of the problems are discipleship issues. And I think, that's what I heard. I hope I'm not putting words in your mouth, but I think that's what 100%. I heard from you. Would you 100%. Concur?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. And let me just say this too, that it's important to understand, and I've experienced this, so I need to become more like Jesus, but there's this tremendous pressure that are on worship pastors right now, especially in churches that are, small, medium-sized churches, to be like churches that are mega churches that have budgets and talent that, we just don't have. There's this internal pressure, there's this external pressure, and sometimes we start focusing more on the music and the systems, and we forget about this piece that we're talking about, which is the heart of the matter. It's that being a disciple of Jesus first. Let those other things fall into place after that.
And then here's the question I had: What would you advise lead pastors in relationship to how they interact with their worship pastors or worship leaders? I mean, so we kind of looked at it from the worship leader's side, but what would you tell a lead pastor would be helpful to hear from them? Or what does a worship pastor need from them in order to function?
Let me just say, over 23 years, I have come up with some crazy ideas. All right. I would say one thing that a lead pastor can help a worship pastor is let them be creative and don't edit every single idea that they come up with in the moment. Let them dream. Let them be some of these things are like who we are. We feel really passionate about it. And if everything is edited in the moment all the time, I can see how someone could become, discouraged. And so I think what we need is we do need encouragement. We need healthy encouragement. And we also need lead pastors that know what's going on the inside. Because a lot of times, we'll stand up there and we'll look like everything's put together, but inside, maybe we're feeling super insecure. Or we got a comment from the parishioner that said, you know what, I didn't really like the song you chose, or I didn't like the volume. And so we're dealing with that one negative comment. And we really need the encouragement. We do need that from our lead pastors. And just how am I doing internally? How's my soul care doing? Those kinds of things I think are sometimes overlooked.
Yeah, I think it's like sometimes we lose touch with the people on our team as humans.
Yes.
We forget they're not cogs in a machine, but they're real people with real problems and pain and responsibilities and hopes and dreams and all of that. And remembering that I would say this to lead pastors. I'm not a worship pastor, but I would say this to lead pastors, making sure that the people on your team know that you are interested in them.
Yeah.
And you care about them beyond the professional side of what they do, the ministry side of what they do. You actually care about their marriage and their family and you mentioned it, their self-care, their well-being. Shannon, I'm wondering if you'll join us for another one, because we've got a whole bunch of other questions we'd like to ask you. Would you join us for another podcast?
For sure. Absolutely. My
All
pleasure.
right.
Great. Well, thanks everybody for joining us today. And Shannon, John, thank you for the questions, the answers, the wisdom. It's a complex thing. Anything that's alive, especially when it deals with art, is going to be infinite. So to have categories, guidelines, best practices laid out by someone who's been doing this for decades is a wonderful gift. So thank you to both of you for your gifts and how you shared them today. We look forward to next week. So if there's anything we can do for you at Converge, that is our heart, to do something for you. What can we do? How can we help? And we'll give you 30 minutes for free just by going to convergecoach.com and hitting that button, and we'll connect and we'll spend some time. So God bless you. Thanks again to everybody who watched, everybody who's listening, everyone who spoke. God is using this in a neat way to really encourage people. We keep hearing stories about it was the right thing in the right place at the right time. So thank you to both of you. Thank you everyone who's listening for being the right thing, the right person, right place, right time as you continue to lead from a life.